In 1900, Buffalo, New York was the 8th largest city in America. 8th, ahead of San Francisco, ahead of Milwaukee, ahead of Washington, D.C. It had more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the country, a downtown bristling with buildings designed by the most celebrated architects of the age, and a waterfront that handled more tonnage than all but 2 ports on Earth. Today, its population is less than half what it was at its peak, and most Americans, if they think of Buffalo at all, think of snow and chicken wings. The distance between those two facts is one of the great unfinished stories of American capitalism, and it begins with a ditch. Not a metaphorical ditch, an actual ditch, 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, stretching 363 miles from the Hudson River to the eastern shore of Lake Erie. DeWitt Clinton's political enemies called it Clinton's Ditch. Clinton himself called it the future. When it opened in 1825, the Erie Canal did something no road, no river, no act of Congress had managed to do. It connected the interior of a continent to the sea, and the place where the canal met the Great Lakes, the exact point where a bushel of wheat grown in Ohio could begin its journey to a flour mill in New York or a bakery in Liverpool, was a small village at the mouth of Buffalo Creek. Population in 1820, about 200 souls. Within 5 years of the canal's opening, that village had swelled to more than 8,000. By 1840, it was past 18,000. The math was straightforward. Before the canal, shipping a ton of wheat from Buffalo to New York City cost roughly $100 and took 2 weeks by stagecoach. After the canal, the same ton cost $10 and arrived in 5 days. That 90% drop in shipping costs didn't just move grain more cheaply. It rearranged the economy of half a continent. Farmers in Indiana and Illinois who had been sending their crops down the Mississippi to New Orleans now sent them east across Lake Erie to Buffalo. And Buffalo, positioned at the bottleneck where Lake met Canal, became the place where everything paused, was handled, was counted, was priced, and was sent on its way. The trouble in those early years was the handling. Grain arrived in the holds of lake schooners, loose and heavy, and it had to be transferred to narrower canal boats for the trip east. The transfer was done the way grain had been moved since antiquity, by men with shovels and bags and their own aching backs. Irish immigrants mostly, hundreds of them, working the docks of Buffalo's inner harbor, scooping grain by hand. A single ship could take days to unload. The system worked, barely, when Buffalo was receiving 100,000 bushels a year. But by the late 1830s, shipments from Michigan and Illinois were flooding in, and the harbor was choking on its own success. Enter Joseph Dart. Dart was a Connecticut-born merchant who had arrived in Buffalo in 1821 when the village had fewer than 2,000 people. He'd opened a shop at Main and Swan Streets selling hats, leather, and furs. And he'd learned the Iroquois dialects of the local Seneca people well enough that Native Americans visiting town would entrust their valuables to his care. Among his customers was the Seneca orator Red Jacket, who used the iron safe in Dart's shop to store his wampum belt. Dart did well enough in hats, but when the grain trade exploded, he saw something bigger. He'd read about an inventor named Oliver Evans who had devised a system of belts and buckets to move flour around inside a mill. And Dart thought, what if you took that idea, scaled it up, powered it with steam, and used it to scoop grain directly out of a ship's hull? People told him it was foolish. A forwarding merchant named Malin Kingman took pity on Dart and informed him, with what passes for gentleness among forwarding merchants, that Irishmen's backs were the cheapest elevators ever built. Dart built it anyway. He hired Robert Dunbar, a Scottish-born engineer who had arrived in Buffalo from Canada, and together they erected a wooden structure on the bank of the Buffalo River at the junction of the Evans Ship Canal. Dart's elevator, as it came to be known, opened in June of 1843. On its first day of real operation, it unloaded the schooner Philadelphia, 4,515 bushels of wheat, in a matter of hours. The same job, done by hand, would have taken a gang of men the better part of a week. That wooden structure on the riverbank changed the world, though it would take a few years for the world to notice. Dart's bucket system could handle 2,000 bushels an hour, the equivalent of a full crew working a full day in ideal conditions. Within 4 years, 9 more steam-powered grain elevators had gone up along Buffalo's waterfront, and Dunbar was getting commissions to build them as far away as Liverpool and Odessa. By 1855, the Board of Trade and Commerce could declare without much exaggeration that Buffalo was universally acknowledged to be the greatest grain market on the continent, not even excepting the city of New York. By 1887, the city had 43 grain elevators worth a collective $8 million, capable of moving 4 million bushels in a single day. Walk along the Buffalo River in those years, and you would have seen them rising in rows, the wooden ones first, then the steel ones, and finally the great concrete monoliths that European architects like Le Corbusier would later travel across the ocean to admire. The grain elevators were Buffalo's cathedrals, immense, vertical, and built for a purpose that the city believed would last forever. By the time of the Civil War, Buffalo was handling over 7 million barrels of wheat and flour annually, despite the fact that cold weather closed the harbor and canal every winter. The city's position only grew stronger when the railroads arrived to supplement the canal, adding new routes for grain heading east and manufactured goods heading west. By 1899, Buffalo had about 52 grain elevators, including 4 floating ones and a series of transfer towers, and had become the 3rd largest port in the world in terms of tonnage. Those elevators are still there today, most of them, silent and enormous against the sky, lining a river that carries almost no commercial traffic. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The grain trade built Buffalo's fortune, but the Erie Canal built something more, a crossroads. Buffalo wasn't just where grain changed boats. It was where people changed direction. Thousands of pioneers heading west debarked from canal boats in Buffalo and continued their journey by lake steamer or later by rail. They stopped for a night or a week, and while they stopped, they spent money. Hotels, saloons, boarding houses, and provisioners lined the waterfront. The canal district earned a reputation for pleasures and dangers in roughly equal measure. Meanwhile, everything that the expanding West needed, tools, cloth, machinery, manufactured goods, flowed in the opposite direction from east to west through the same bottleneck. Buffalo was collecting a toll on the movement of an entire civilization, and the toll was making people very, very rich. You could see the wealth taking shape on Delaware Avenue. Starting in the 1880s and running through the first 2 decades of the new century, the stretch of Delaware between North and Bryant Streets became the richest residential address in America. Not the richest in Buffalo, the richest in the country. Grain merchants, steel barons, bankers, and manufacturers lined the avenue with mansions in every fashionable style the age could offer. Renaissance Revival, Gothic Revival, Romanesque, Neoclassical. Stanford White designed the Williams Pratt Mansion at 690 Delaware, a neoclassical showpiece completed in 1896 for Charles Williams, who sat on the boards of 3 banks and owned half the real estate in the surrounding neighborhoods. Next door at 672, his brother George had Stanford White build him a 16,000 square foot mansion with an 8,000 square foot carriage house. The Clement Mansion at 786, finished in 1914 for an astonishing $300,000, was a gray sandstone Tudor with a music room a story and a half tall, with its own pipe organ, where Buffalo's elite gathered on winter evenings for recitals and conversation. The original yards on the west side of Delaware Avenue ran all the way back to Richmond Avenue. This was not a street. It was a declaration, and the declaration was backed by something real. The wealth pouring into Buffalo in the 1890s was not speculative. It came from grain, obviously, but also from iron, steel, lumber, milling, leather, soap, and the railroads that knitted all of it together. The city was a place where things were made and things were moved, and in 1896, 2 buildings went up on Main Street that announced in steel and stone that Buffalo intended to be a great American city for a very long time. The first was the Ellicott Square building. Commissioned by the Ellicott Company, the descendants of Joseph Ellicott, the surveyor who had laid out Buffalo's radial street plan in 1804, it was designed by Charles Atwood of Daniel Burnham's firm in Chicago. It cost $3.5 million and took less than a year to build. When it opened in May of 1896, it was the largest office building in the world,
10 stories of steel frame construction clad in granite, iron, and terracotta, with 60 offices, 40 retail shops, a law library, a businessman's club on the top floor, and a central court finished in Italian marble under a soaring glass roof. Every office had electric lights, steam heat, a marble wash bowl, and a telephone connecting it to every other office in the building. In the basement, there was a bicycle room. This was 1896, remember. Buffalo had arrived somewhere, and the Ellicott Square building was the address.
The building also housed, starting that year, the world's earliest known dedicated motion picture theater, the Vitascope Theater, operated in a space called Edisonia Hall. Movies had existed for only a few months. The first audiences watched flickering images in a room inside the world's largest office building, in a city that was inventing the future while processing the grain that fed the present. 2 blocks away, another building was going up at the same time, and this one would matter even more to the history of architecture. The Guarantee Building, designed by Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler, was completed in 1896 at the corner of Church and Pearl Streets. Sullivan, who would come to be called the father of the American skyscraper, conceived the 13-story structure as a single unified form, not a stack of smaller buildings piled on top of each other, the way Burnham's Ellicott Square could appear, but a soaring vertical mass clad in ornamental terracotta, every inch of its surface alive with Sullivan's organic, almost botanical, decorative patterns. It was one of the first steel-framed, curtain-walled buildings in the world. It cost roughly $600,000. Sullivan had come to Buffalo because his firm was collapsing in the aftermath of the Panic of 1893, and this commission, funded by a local businessman named Haskell Taylor, would be the last major work Adler and Sullivan completed together. The building that announced Sullivan's genius also marked the end of his partnership. It stands today, a National Historic Landmark since 1975, still visually stunning, still unlike anything else on the street. These were not isolated monuments. They were products of a city that was rich enough and confident enough to commission the best. Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park in New York, chose Buffalo as the first city for which he would design an entire interconnected system of parks and parkways rather than a single park. When Olmsted visited the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, he declared Buffalo the best planned city as to its streets, public places, and grounds in the United States, if not in the world. H. Richardson, considered one of the 3 greatest American architects of the 19th century alongside Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, designed the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane, now called the Richardson Olmsted Complex, a massive Romanesque fortress of Medina sandstone that opened in 1880 and remains one of the most striking buildings in the eastern United States. And then there was electricity. 22 miles to the north, Niagara Falls had been generating hydroelectric power on a small scale since the 1880s. But it wasn't until 1895 that Nikola Tesla's alternating current system, built in partnership with George Westinghouse, made it possible to transmit that power at high voltage over long distances. In 1896, the year the Guarantee Building and the Ellicott Square building opened, the switch was flipped, and the first surge of electricity from Niagara Falls reached Buffalo. The city that processed the nation's grain and shipped the nation's steel was now powered by the nation's greatest waterfall. The age of cheap, abundant electricity had begun, and Buffalo was its first customer. This was the city that decided, at the turn of the century, to host a World's Fair. The Pan-American Exposition of 1901 occupied 350 acres on the western edge of Delaware Park, and its purpose was to celebrate the progress of the Western Hemisphere, which in practice meant celebrating electricity and celebrating Buffalo's proximity to the source. The exposition's centerpiece was the Electric Tower, designed by John Galen Howard, a 410-foot structure that served as a massive beacon of light, illuminated by nearly 250,000 colored bulbs powered by Niagara Falls. At night, the effect was staggering. The exposition earned the nickname the Rainbow City. 8 million visitors came between May and November. The exposition is remembered today for one event, and it is not a happy one. On September 5, 1901, President William McKinley gave a speech on trade policy to a large crowd on the Esplanade. The next day, designated President's Day at the exposition, McKinley stood in a receiving line at the Temple of Music, an $85,000 concert hall with a dome rising 180 feet and seating for 2,000. He had been greeting the public for 7 minutes when a 28-year-old anarchist named Leon Czolgosz, his hand wrapped in a handkerchief concealing a revolver, stepped forward and shot the president twice. An X-ray machine, one of the new technologies on display at the exposition, sat in a building nearby. The doctors were reluctant to use it. McKinley died 8 days later from gangrene. Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as president at the Wilcox Mansion on Delaware Avenue, in a private home in a residential neighborhood, because that was the kind of city Buffalo was, a place where a president could take the oath of office in someone's parlor. By early 1902, demolition crews were pulling down the exposition's plaster buildings. The Rainbow City vanished in a matter of months. The only structure that survived was the New York State Building, built of marble, which stands today as the Buffalo History Museum. But the exposition had done its work. The city's population, already past 352,000 before the fair, continued to climb. People who had come as visitors decided to stay. Industries that had seen what Niagara power could do relocated to western New York. The first decade of the 20th century was, in many ways, Buffalo's finest hour. Consider what the city was producing. The Larkin Soap Company, founded in 1875 by John D. Larkin, had grown from a single product into a national mail-order empire selling soap, groceries, dry goods, china, and furniture to middle-class households in all 48 states. By 1919, the company employed over 2,000 people at its sprawling complex on Seneca Street, 64% of them young, single women. In South Buffalo, the saying went that a young woman could work at the H.O. Cereal Company, or, if she was lucky, the Larkin Company. Larkin's executive Darwin D. Martin was so impressed by a young architect from Chicago that he convinced the board to hire the man to design the company's new administration building. The architect was Frank Lloyd Wright, and the building he created at 680 Seneca Street, completed in 1906, was his first major commercial commission. It was a 5-story, dark red brick fortress that turned its back on the gritty industrial neighborhood outside and opened inward to a 76-foot-tall light court flooded with natural sun. Wright designed everything: the steel furniture, the light fixtures, the china for the workers' cafeteria. He included a pipe organ for lunchtime entertainment, a lending library, and a conservatory. The building had air conditioning, or an early version of it, half a decade before Willis Carrier would refine the technology. It cost $4 million. European architects would travel to see it. The building, Wright said, was built to stand forever. And speaking of Willis Carrier, in 1902, a 25-year-old Cornell graduate named Willis Haviland Carrier, born on a dairy farm in the village of Angola, 25 miles south of Buffalo, was working at the Buffalo Forge Company for $10 a week. That year, in response to a humidity problem at a printing plant in Brooklyn, Carrier designed what is generally regarded as the first modern air conditioning system. He patented it in 1906. He founded Carrier Engineering Corporation in 1915. Air conditioning, the technology that would reshape American architecture, enable the growth of the Sun Belt, and make the modern office building possible, was invented in Buffalo, New York by a man who earned less in a week than a good dinner at the Ellicott Square Buildings restaurant. The George N. Pierce Company had been manufacturing bird cages since 1865. Bird cages, delicate, gilded things that sat in parlors. In the 1890s, the company pivoted to bicycles. By 1901, it had built its first automobile. Within a decade, Pierce Arrow motor cars were among the most prestigious luxury vehicles in the world. Hand-built, immaculately engineered, powered by enormous 6-cylinder engines that displaced more than 13 liters. President William Howard Taft ordered 2 Pierce Arrows for the White House in 1909, making them the first official presidential automobiles. The factory complex on Elmwood Avenue, designed by the great industrial architect Albert Kahn around 1906, covered more than 1.5 million square feet. During the First World War, Pierce Arrow employed almost 10,000 men and women. The company's advertisements were quietly artistic, almost literary. They didn't sell cars. They sold a world in which owning a Pierce Arrow was simply what one did. Imagine for a moment Main Street on a Saturday evening in 1912. The Ellicott Square building is lit from within, its marble court alive with the sounds of diners at the restaurant where Ellsworth Statler once placed $5 gold coins in random bowls of ice cream to draw a crowd. Statler, a former bellboy from Wheeling, West Virginia, had passed through Buffalo on his way home from a fishing trip in Canada, noticed the construction of the Ellicott Square building, heard the owners were looking for someone to run a restaurant inside, and jumped at the chance. He opened the Statler restaurant in 1896 and kept 500 diners coming back by sheer force of showmanship and attention to detail. He used that restaurant as a stepping stone. For the Pan-American Exposition in 1901, Statler built and ran a temporary hotel near the fairgrounds, and from the profits of that venture, he built the first Hotel Statler in 1907 on the southeast corner of Washington and Swan Streets. 300 rooms, 300 baths. A radical idea in an age when shared bathrooms were the norm. The building, designed by Essenwein and Johnson, was a steel frame construction covered in glazed polychrome terracotta, creme-colored with green stylized plant forms. The Statler plumbing shaft, his patented invention that allowed bathrooms to be built back-to-back and share a common wall of pipes, would become the standard for hotel construction across America, and the reason every hotel room you have ever stayed in has a private bathroom. By the 1920s, Statler had hotels in Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, and New York, but he'd build his grandest one, 1,100 rooms, an $8 million palace on Niagara Square designed by George B. Post and Sons, with a lobby of Botticino marble in the style of the Italian Renaissance, a 28-foot ceiling, a ballroom, 4 dining rooms, a swimming pool, a Turkish bath, and a 24-chair barbershop, right here in the city that gave him his start. To ensure that the social center of Buffalo would shift from Main Street to Niagara Square, Statler bought and closed his main rival, the Iroquois Hotel, so the city's elite would have no choice but to come to him. The hotel opened in 1923 and immediately became the place where Buffalo's deals were made, its weddings celebrated, and its visiting dignitaries housed. Presidents stayed there, Elvis stayed there, Dean Martin stayed there. It was, in a very real sense, the living room of the city. Walk south from Ellicott Square on that 1912 evening, and you'd pass theaters, saloons, shops selling everything from fur coats to patent medicines. The theater district around the 600 block of Main Street was one of the largest concentrations of theaters in the country. Michael Shea, born in Buffalo's Old First Ward in 1859, had been building theaters and entertainment venues across the city since the 1880s. In the 1920s, he would open 6 more, including the jewel of them all, Shea's Buffalo Theater, a 3,000-seat Baroque palace at 646 Main Street, designed by the Rapp brothers of Chicago, the masters of movie palace architecture. It opened on January 16, 1926, and cost $2 million. The interior was a European fantasy in plaster and gilt, chandeliers the size of automobiles, a mighty Wurlitzer pipe organ, marble lobbies with mirrored walls, and ushers trained, it was said, by an Annapolis graduate. The Marx Brothers performed there. So did Bob Hope, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Bing Crosby, and George Burns and Gracie Allen. On a Friday night in 1926, the lights of Shea's Buffalo blazing on Main Street, a Pierce Arrow idling at the curb, the Statler Hotel glowing on Niagara Square a few blocks west. This was a city that could stand beside any in America and not look away. The population had passed 423,000 and was still climbing. The streetcars ran on electricity from Niagara Falls. The avenues were lined with elms. At the waterfront, the grain elevators rose against the lake sky, and between 1900 and 1928, Buffalo's grain production skyrocketed from 111 million bushels to 280 million. The city had even surpassed Minneapolis as the nation's leading flour producer, powered by the cheap hydroelectricity that flowed from the falls. And the ore boats unloaded iron for the steel mills that were spreading along the shore of Lake Erie, in a town just south of Buffalo, a town that, in a peculiar American twist, had named itself after the steel company that was its reason for existing. The Lackawanna Steel Company had moved its entire operation from Scranton, Pennsylvania, to the shores of Lake Erie in 1899, drawn by cheap Great Lakes shipping and the web of rail lines converging on Buffalo. The company built a mill. Then it built a town. The Beaux-Arts Administration Building went up in 1901. Workers arrived by the thousands. Poles, Italians, Hungarians, Irishmen. The city of Lackawanna was incorporated in 1909, and by the time Bethlehem Steel acquired the company in 1922 for $60 million, the plant stretched 2 miles along the lakefront and employed upward of 20,000 people. Bethlehem spent another $40 million modernizing the facility in the 1920s. The steel from Lackawanna went into the Empire State Building, the Golden Gate Bridge, Rockefeller Center. At its height, it was one of the largest integrated steel plants on Earth. The year 1929 brought 2 things to Buffalo that, in hindsight, seem almost cruelly timed. The first was the Central Terminal. Designed by Alfred Fellheimer and Stewart Wagner for the New York Central Railroad, it cost $14 million to build and opened on June 22, 1929, with a banquet for 2,200 guests catered by the Statler and other hotels. The toastmaster joked that the terminal was so far east of downtown that it served both Buffalo and Rochester. Its 17-story Art Deco tower rose 271 feet over the east side of the city. Its concourse stretched 225 feet long with 60-foot vaulted ceilings. Its restaurant was finished in black Carrara glass, red and green and ivory geometric panels, silver and bronze grillwork, and gold-veined marble. The pinnacle of Art Deco excess, a room where you could eat a club sandwich surrounded by more decorative metalwork than most European museums could muster. 200 passenger trains a day used the station. 10,000 passengers walked through it daily. It was designed for a future in which Buffalo would keep growing, keep building, keep moving. Along with the Buffalo City Hall, which would follow 2 years later, a monumental Art Deco tower designed by Dietl and Wade, featuring indigenous American motifs and soaring limestone walls. The Central Terminal announced that Buffalo intended to build at the scale of civilizations, not merely cities. The second thing 1929 brought was October. The stock market crash did not destroy Buffalo overnight. The city's industrial base was broad enough, and its infrastructure deep enough that the Depression, while painful, did not gut the place the way it gutted cities built on speculation. What the crash did was close a door. Buffalo's population growth, which had slowed in the 1920s, essentially stopped. The 1930 census recorded 573,076. The 1940 census recorded 575,901, an increase of less than 3,000 people in a decade. The city was no longer pulling people in. It was holding them in place. Pierce Arrow, the company that built automobiles for presidents and princes, could not survive a depression that destroyed the market for luxury goods. The company had never built a cheaper car to generate cash flow the way Packard did. When Studebaker, which had acquired Pierce Arrow in 1928, itself went bankrupt in 1933, a group of Buffalo businessmen led by George F. Rand Jr. bought the operation and tried to keep it alive. They lasted 5 years. Pierce Arrow closed its doors for good in 1938. Its remaining assets were sold at auction on a Friday the 13th. Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Administration Building, the masterpiece on Seneca Street that was built to stand forever, began its own decline when the Larkin Company, unable to recover from the Depression, tried to sell the building in 1943. No buyer came. The city seized it for back taxes in 1945. For the next 5 years, the building stood empty and was stripped by vandals. 20 tons of copper plumbing and roofing stolen. Every double-paned window shattered. The iron entrance gate toppled from rusted hinges. In 1949, it was sold for $5,000 to a company that promised to demolish it and build a truck stop. Despite nationwide protests, the wrecking ball swung in 1950. The truck stop was never built. Today, a single brick pier at the edge of the lot and a pocket park with an interpretive panel mark the spot where one of the most important office buildings in the history of architecture once stood. The Second World War revived Buffalo's factories. Steel production surged under military contracts.
The chemical plants and aircraft factories ran at full capacity. The central terminal handled troop trains day and night. By 1950, the census recorded 580,132 people, the highest figure the city would ever reach. Buffalo was the 15th largest city in America. 80% of area jobs were in manufacturing. The future, if you stood on Main Street in 1950 and looked around, might still have seemed secure.
But the math was already changing. The St. Lawrence Seaway, proposed since the 19th century as a faster shipping route connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, opened in 1959. It allowed ocean-going vessels to bypass Buffalo entirely, to sail from Duluth or Chicago straight to the sea without stopping at the bottleneck where canal met lake. The city's reason for existing, the geographic advantage that Joseph Dart had exploited and that a century of investment had built upon, was suddenly obsolete. The port and barge canal became, almost overnight, irrelevant. Grain still flowed, but it no longer flowed through Buffalo.
At the Bethlehem Steel Plant in Lackawanna, employment had declined from nearly 20,000 in 1965 to 8,500 by 1977. The company blamed high property taxes. Analysts blamed aging facilities and foreign competition. The real problem was that Bethlehem had built a newer, more modern plant in Burns Harbor, Indiana, closer to the Midwestern customers who bought most of the steel, and Lackawanna's business was being quietly transferred there. On June 25, 1982, Bethlehem Steel announced it would close the Lackawanna facility and lay off its remaining 10,000 workers. The city of Lackawanna, facing a $4 million annual loss in property tax revenue, laid off 100 city workers and 18 police officers. Property taxes for the remaining residents roughly doubled. The Central Terminal, the Art Deco palace designed for 200 trains a day, saw its traffic dwindle through the 1950s and 1960s as Americans chose cars and planes. The New York Central put the building up for sale in 1956 for $1 million, 1/14 of what it had cost to build. No buyer was found. In 1966, the railroad demolished the Pullman building, the coach shop, the ice house, and the powerhouse just to reduce its tax bill. The last Amtrak train left the Central Terminal on October 28, 1979. The building was sold for $75,000. The new owner began stripping out anything of value. The population numbers tell the rest. 580,132 in 1950, 532,759 in 1960, 462,768 in 1970, 357,870 in 1980, 328,123 in 1990. Each decade, another cohort left for the suburbs, for the Sun Belt, for anywhere the jobs had gone. By 2006, the population had fallen to roughly what it had been in 1890, reversing 120 years of growth. The Broadway market, the heart of Buffalo's Polish East Side, stayed open, but the neighborhood around it emptied. The mansions on Delaware Avenue were converted to apartments or offices or torn down. The Kensington Expressway, rammed through the East Side in the 1960s, obliterated Frederick Law Olmsted's Humboldt Parkway and cut neighborhoods in half. Shea's Buffalo Theater, Michael Shea's $2 million Wonder Theater that had opened in 1926 with a Baroque interior designed by the Rapp brothers, 3,000 seats, a Wurlitzer organ, and ushers trained by an Annapolis graduate, nearly went under the wrecking ball in the 1970s before a group called the Friends of the Buffalo Theater fought to save it and got it listed on the National Register of Historic Places. More than $30 million in restoration work, much of it done by volunteers, has since kept the theater alive. It remains one of the only surviving Tiffany-designed theaters in the country, a gilded dream of 1926 sitting on a block of Main Street that has never quite recaptured what it was.
The Ellicott Square building still stands at 295 Main Street. The mosaic floor of its central court, installed in 1930, was made from 23 million individual pieces of Italian marble, arranged in compass points and sun symbols from civilizations around the globe. You can walk in today, stand on that floor, look up through the glass roof, and feel for a moment what it must have been like in 1896 when this was the largest office building in the world, and the men who worked here believed they were building something permanent. In the basement, there is no longer a bicycle room. The grain elevators still line the Buffalo River, enormous and silent. Some have been repurposed for concerts and light shows. Most simply stand there, concrete monuments to an industry that went elsewhere, designed by Robert Dunbar's successors to hold millions of bushels of wheat that will never arrive. The river that once carried the grain trade of a continent barely carries a kayak now. In certain light, at a certain hour, the elevators look almost beautiful, gray and massive against the lake sky, the way a ruin can look beautiful when enough time has passed that you've forgotten what it cost.